Okay. Hey, everyone. My name is Frank David. You're at STAT's virtual event, How to Spot and Avoid Clinical Trial Risk. So hopefully you're in the right place. Thank you everyone for joining. So I'm the managing director at Pharmagellan, and this is the first of a series that we're going to be running through STAT on that we're calling Decoding Clinical Trials. We're going to get into the content in a sec, but before we do, I just want to raise a couple of housekeeping points. So I'm sure all of you are seasoned pros when it comes to Zoom. You'll see at the bottom there are the two buttons, the chat button and the Q&A button. Feel free to use the chat button to chat amongst yourselves or to talk to the STAT team, but that's not actually where you should put questions if you have questions about the content. Please use the Q&A button for the questions. We're going to try to answer them. I'm not sure exactly whether we're going to be doing some of them as we go or whether we'll save time at the end. We will figure that out on the fly, so to speak. But one thing you can do is if you keep that Q&A window open, you'll be able to see the questions that other people have posted. And if there are ones that you particularly would like to hear addressed, then feel free to upvote them. And that way we'll know that more people are interested in those. So with that, it's really a pleasure to introduce Ken Getz to this session. He's a professor at Tufts University School of Medicine. For the purposes of today's discussion, it's salient to know that he's the executive director of Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development. Those of you who may not have heard of that center are probably familiar with the articles that come out periodically saying things like it costs $2.6 billion to make a new drug. That's all out of the CSDD. But that's not what we're going to talk about today, although I love that topic desperately. I would love to spend time on it. What we're actually going to talk about today is the work that Ken and his team have done on benchmarking of clinical trials, and specifically pharma-sponsored clinical trials. And Ken's special areas of interest include protocol design and also the efficiency and effectiveness of clinical trials, and really what pharma companies do right and wrong in those domains, how aspects of clinical trial execution and protocol design increase or decrease the risk of clinical trials, and what companies can do about it. So super excited. Thank you so much for doing this, Ken. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Frank. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. So let's start out. You and I had a quick call before, and I'm going to start exactly where I had proposed starting out, which is, I do biotech consulting, so I'm talking to clients all the time about clinical trials, clinical trial design, clinical trial risk. And what I hear from biotechs is that it is harder and more complicated to run successful trials than it was before, let's say 5 years ago. So are they just complaining, or is there actually some truth to that?
There's a ton of truth to that. In my 30 years studying a protocol design practice, Frank, and the performance that's related to it, it is so clear that our designs are much more complex today, and it has so many different dimensions. Our trials are so much more customized, so they're literally recruiting even more narrowly defined patient populations. There are a larger number of endpoints. We're conducting more procedures. We're including more countries. We have more investigative sites of all different types. Some are individual investigators, others may be more established, larger scale academic institutions. We have a whole host of intermediaries, technology providers, contract research organizations. So at every level, scientific and operationally, our protocols are much harder to execute today. They're not really complaining. And if you look at performance, you can see what's happening. Protocol complexity is associated with longer timelines, higher levels of inefficiency, higher costs, all the things that we see people complaining about.
So there's a lot there, and I think we'll get to all the different parts. But I guess the first thing that I wanted to ask about was to just stay on this protocol point. So I totally, I also have seen that in oncology, for example, there's a lot more pressure to more narrowly focus the patient population. There's more, there's more collection of different endpoints. There's maybe more biopsies, et cetera. So I guess part of what I'm wondering is it seems like there's a tension between, on the one hand, a lot of those things have arisen to increase the probability of a trial succeeding. And then on the other hand, as you point out, that makes it harder and maybe, more prone to error slash failure on the operational side. So how do you see those two things balancing out? I mean, it seems, and I'll just confess that, when we advise clients, we certainly are advising on the side of, well, collect more samples and more narrowly tailor your patient population, et cetera. So I do have a little bit of concern that maybe I'm wrong.
You raise such an important issue that so few are really able to clearly answer. That relationship between the collection of more data, designing more complex trials, and hoping to see on the other end higher success rates when in fact we're seeing the opposite. Our success rates are the worst they've ever been in our history. And in fact, now an estimated 93% of all drugs that enter clinical testing will fail to receive approval, which is just remarkable. Some try to address the question by suggesting that the diseases we're studying are just that much more difficult, right, to demonstrate safety and an efficacy, a signal efficacy, and more importantly. Some of it has to do with the fact that it's a much more competitive environment today. So many of our trials are targeting rare disease populations for which there's a very, very limited number of patients, and there may be multiple trials that are being conducted, all vying for the same patients. And if I recall, Frank, you and your colleagues even have published work trying to make a case for there being geographic areas where there are just too many trials that are going on. One of the reasons why we move trials to other countries, of course, is to be able to reach physicians as well as patient populations that have not had an opportunity to participate in the past. So there's just a lot going on there. And I think that there isn't a direct relationship between the complexity of the trial and the success rates that we can expect.
So again, if we just pick I guess there's one way I could look at this and say that most of the difference in terms of protocol and other operational issues impacting probability of success is between indications, right? And the other way to look at it would be how much of it is actually sponsor to sponsor variation within the same indication. Because, those, again, like from an investor perspective, those maybe have different implications, right? Like in one case, you're asking, does this program have a higher likelihood of success in the hands of sponsor A versus sponsor B? And in another case, you're saying, well, sponsor A has two different indications that they're working on. Which one of them is inherently more risky because of some of the factors that you've talked about. So tell me a little bit about, forced choice, sort of how much of the weight is on risk being due more to the inherent facts on the ground and how much of it is due to what the decisions that the sponsor actually makes.
Yeah, it's there's a couple ways to answer that. The first point that I'll make is that a lot depends on when a program the decision is made to discontinue it. And that often the largest factors are associated with the safety profile of a candidate in earlier stages of clinical testing. And in later stages, it's really due largely to the inability to demonstrate efficacy. But increasingly, there are other data points that we're gathering, right? The ability to position that product well commercially, if it were approved. And we have seen in the literature and in work that we've done, about 20% of all failures are associated with the decision not to move forward due to commercial reasons, as opposed to scientific, in this case, the technical risk or the efficacy. So there's that element. But the other point I want to make is there are a whole host of operating challenges that may inherently be due to the poor ways that we manage so many of these activities while a trial is underway. So a tremendous amount of inefficiency and the inability to coordinate a disparate collection of resources and individuals or teams. There's a lot going on there as well.
I mean, one way that I think that this manifests in kind of the popular discourse and Twitter, to the extent that Twitter is a reflection of reality, is kind of this classic pharma versus biotech cage match, right? Where, there's this long-standing debate where you look at a given program and you say, is it more likely to be successful in a small company or in a large company? And I think that some of the tension is exactly what you've been describing, right? Which is large companies, I would say in general, all else being equal, are more likely to overinvest in wider geographic breadth. They're more likely to have experience actually on the operational side. They're more likely to invest in collecting additional endpoints, collecting additional patient samples, et cetera. On the other hand, small companies are more likely to kind of go lean and hard, right? Because they're somewhat cash constrained. So is there anything to be said from the operational point of view in terms of that general question? Do you think that, if I'm, biotech not otherwise specified versus BMS, looking at the same program, do we, nominally the same program, same drug and the same indication, what are your thoughts in terms of how these operational factors play out in terms of success?
It's a great question. We see wide differences in the way very small emerging biotech operates relative to major pharma. And for a lot of the reasons that you've described. And in some cases, we see that smaller companies tend to be leaner and faster and perhaps more efficient. But we also see that the resource constraints actually elicit some behaviors that actually drive longer timelines. For example, in smaller companies, often we see the desire to collect more data because it's really the only asset that is currently in clinical testing. So you've got the patient in the clinic, why not collect more data? Big pharma tends to have the most rigorously established operating procedures and practices. And so for them, it's often the inefficiency that exists in a larger bureaucratic process. The mid-sized companies are really in the worst place imaginable because they often are not operating as leanly, right? They have started to create functional silos that you often don't see in the smaller companies, but they don't have the infrastructure and the resources of big pharma. So often we see the highest amount of inefficiency among the mid-size companies. When it comes to protocol complexity, smaller companies tend to have slightly more complex designs. And one other point that I just want to make there is that often the people in the smaller companies were trained and learned in big pharma, and often they're bringing a lot of those habits and practices with them into a smaller environment, smaller company environment.
That's interesting. You've almost made like the anti-Goldilocks argument, right? With the too big or too small. The opposite, the thing that lies between them is actually just wrong as opposed to just right. But I was thinking just when you were talking about the team at the end there, often in diligence kinds of assessments with, as an external investor who's looking at doing due diligence on a small company, often one of the things you can look at is the experience and expertise and sort of depth of the team, right? And it's not a complete reflection of what's going on in clinical trials, because obviously that team, if it's a small company, is also benefiting from a contract research organization usually, and they're sucking in some expertise there. But then you flip that over to a BMS or a Merck or an AZ, for example, where much more of that expertise is and execution is being handled in-house. Anything specific to that? Are there things? Does the team? I guess the way I'd like to frame the question is, first of all, does the team matter when you're looking at small companies?
I have, for a very long time, believed that the caliber of the team plays a big part. And yet, in my 30 years as an outsider looking in, I have yet to see consistent contribution based solely on the caliber of the team. And in fact, I think it's harder now for the team to have as much of an influence as it did a decade ago. And maybe it's because, as you're suggesting, Frank, there are just so many intermediaries that are now involved, even within big pharma, although the tendency may not be to outsource in the same way that you would see with such heavy reliance in the small companies. You still see a dozen or so vendors that are providing a single technology, perhaps to measure an endpoint digitally, or the use of a specialty lab, or the engagement of investigators who've never before been in a trial, but they happen to have a sizable, relatively good-sized, rare patient population. It's harder and harder for really good teams to be as effective. And often the most talented people are so far removed from the day-to-day executional challenges that it's very difficult for the team alone to really sort of drive success, if success is measured by efficiency and speed and lower cost.
Huh. Interesting. And do you think that there's any, to the extent that an external person could figure out what CROs is the small company working with, for example, does that end up having value, or is it just really hard to figure out? I know this is probably a little bit of field, but at least in theory, you could imagine that, again, some CROs may be better or worse in terms of helping to navigate some of these, or maybe they're more similar than different.
I think that the natural inclination to want to get a feel for the expertise and the energy level, the commitment of the team is a critical first step. But I think there are so many characteristics, operating characteristics, that have to be weighed in addition to that in order to get a really good feel for the risk exposure. So I think that I think and hope that we'll have a chance to really flush out some of those as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what I'm hearing from you is that when I'm looking at a biotech trial, I should not necessarily be getting obsessed over whether the senior people on the development team have a lot of prior experience, and sort of what their heritage and background is, because essentially a lot of them are just going to be relying on CROs, and actually a lot of the real, when the rubber hits the road, it's really going to depend more on that than it will on necessarily anything that I'd be able to glean from reading bios.
Or let me add to that. I think that that is what I'm suggesting. I think that the caliber of the team and the knowledge base may really give you a good grounding in the science. But at an executional level, it is very, very difficult to look at some of the basic measures of an individual's experience to really glean a good sense for operationally how successful the team will be.
Great. I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned in passing a little while ago, just about, again, talking about oncology, which is one of the places where I think, at least to my, non-academically oriented view, it seems like oncology is one of the places where just this protocol complexity issue has really exploded. And again, I think for both for smaller companies and even when we've talked to larger companies, I think one reason that certainly we've heard and also we've articulated to clinical teams in terms of why to overinvest or heavily invest in collecting more samples, et cetera, is that often these are pretty small trials, especially these early stage programs, and you're unlikely to get a home run. I mean, miracles happen, but in the average sort of 1B, 2A type of study, you're going to get some complete responses, some partial responses, and left to sort of figure out what it all means. And both in terms of informing your own decision whether or not to move forward, and also for the small companies being able to potentially fundraise off of it, having some ancillary data, whether it's pharmacologic data showing that you're hitting the target, showing that you're modulating downstream signaling pathways, showing some sense of, well, it's a small number of patients, but I'm going to do a little bit of biomarker and patient selection type of work to try to inform the next trial, that those can actually be extremely useful. So I guess I'm looking to you with, to see whether I'm missing something there. Like, is there an argument for actually that companies either systematically or that some companies are actually investing too much in some of those types of activities?
It's a great question. We've done a number of studies where we've tried to look at the balance of core data and non-core data. I know you've also written about this. There's been an absolute explosion in the volume of data collected. The typical phase 3 protocol collects about 3.5 million data points for a pivotal trial. In oncology, it's approaching 4 million data points, which is a 7-fold increase over where we were about 15 years ago. Just a remarkable growth. Most of the growth in the data collected is on the non-core side. So it's the collection of biomarker and genetic information that may not be directly related to the current primary endpoint or the current study objective. But it also relates to the collection of miscellaneous and tertiary and exploratory endpoints. And if you try to dig into that, though, and really understand why that data is collected, about a third of all data collected is in that non-essential, non-core area. Companies will really point to all the strategic reasons why that data is necessary. And most of them have a pretty compelling value proposition, whether it's positioning the product against a comparison drug once it's introduced into the marketplace, demonstrating its value or comparative effectiveness. There are just so many pressures to collect that data and that don't relate specifically to a primary or key secondary endpoint. So I think it's really hard to tease out how much of it is wasteful, so to speak. It will be used at some point. It may inform a future development activity.
Yeah, no, good point. I want to shift gears a little bit from the protocol piece of it to more of the execution types of things. And there are actually a couple questions in the Q&A that are relevant to this that I'm going to want to bring in. So I feel like we could do one of those classic sort of speed round kinds of things, overhyped or underhyped. And if we did that, we would start in this context with decentralized clinical trials, right? I mean, I feel like I don't open up. I feel like almost every week I see something in Stat and other sources around decentralized clinical trials. I get inundated in my email about these kinds of issues. So I guess I have two questions that are related about decentralized clinical trials. One is, to what extent did it feels like a lot of this got more prominent during the height of COVID. And I'm wondering whether this is sort of a system. Did things actually fundamentally change in terms of COVID, or did COVID just expose the need for a need to think about decentralized trials anyway? And then the second is the sort of overhyped, underhyped question, which is, right. A lot of companies are investing a lot in decentralized trials. I think smaller companies probably look at this, and I'm sure they're getting pitched by CROs all the time about decentralized trials. And how important is this, or is this a distraction? Is it actually a contributor to success, or is it actually some paradoxical contributor to increased risk?
Wow, we could spend our entire.
I know. We're not going to do the whole. We're going to have to make 5 minutes on this.
So really laser focused. So first, I would say, like so many innovative solutions that are impacting operational activity and drug development, it starts off being super overhyped. And we had that here as well. Perhaps because of the pandemic, it was overhyped in an accelerated manner. So we certainly know of trials that were experimenting with telemedicine using wearable devices and mobile applications. But the pandemic sort of, out of necessity, forced more sites and more trials to deploy a remote or virtual solution so the trial could continue while the patient safety was protected. And it was actually that direct experience that in the wake of the pandemic led organizations to decide that they need to take a step back, just like we do in so many other ways, right? We have not collected enough data to really help us understand when the use of these technologies may be best or optimal, which ones patients prefer, which place undue burden on site execution of the trial. So we're sort of at that point now where there's a lot of rethinking, recalibrating. And if you think about it, in most cases with innovations, there has been a long incubation period to pilot test a solution. We leapfrogged that entire experience when the pandemic began. And so companies are taking a huge step back and trying now to do that type of assessment. So we see a lot of return on investment activity. We see a lot of questioning about whether a virtual or remote technology is even appropriate for a specific trial. And I think you're going to see more of that kind of scrutiny and hybridized activity. It's only going to make our trials more difficult, Frank. That's the bottom line, because we're going to pick and choose when a technology solution, a DCT solution might be indicated, and it may only be appropriate for a portion of the patient community being recruited. So our sites and our clinical teams are going to have to be even better at managing multiple executional models simultaneously.
Looking at what we know today in mid-2023, are there one or two of these decentralized approaches that, if you were in front of the chief medical officers or heads of R&D at large pharma, that you would say, look, got to take a step back on a lot of these, but if you have to want to place bets, or if you have to place bets or want to be implementing, these are the one or two that you would really focus on?
So we're seeing telemedicine as being sort of one of the lowest hanging fruits, and some of the convenience elements like a transportation assistance and some type of automated payment process for patients, right? Where you actually do not have to have any kind of physical interaction. Those seem to be just very, very low hanging fruit. But I would say here, there's just so much to be done to really answer the question, is this specific technology even appropriate for a given patient community? We don't have good answers to any of that.
Right. And I think the thing that was notably absent from your list of the things that seem like they're worthwhile would be, to my ear at least, are the remote assessment of endpoints, right? So technologies that are wearables and other types of things. Is that a fair, am I putting words in your mouth, or is that a fair assessment that those are a little less ripe, shall we say?
They're less ripe. There's a lot of activity now to try to measure the value and impact that digital endpoints, for example, or some of these technologies have, but the jury is still out as to whether they will offer a level of automation that might improve efficiency. Are they offering access to data that will help accelerate the trial? And for many, as I know you're aware, there's even the hope that they'll improve access, particularly of patient communities that have historically been underrepresented in our trial. So we don't have answers to any of those sort of conceptual value propositions at this point.
One thing that, again, we talked about in passing, and I want to come back to, is I think you mentioned about how specifically in rare diseases, there's often, a pretty fierce competition for patients. And that's part of what leads to, as you narrow in the patient population, whether it's a subset of a larger indication, some 0.5% biomarker driven subset of lung cancer, for example, or whether it's a bona fide rare disease, just sort of writ large, separate from the biomarker question. So one question that arises there is whether involvement of patient support groups, patient advocacy groups, to what extent does that help to get over the challenges in terms of just more execution risk due to small numbers of patients?
So they help a lot. And we've seen an explosion in the number of pharma patient advocacy group relationships. They've really played a key role in helping to provide input into the design of the study and to really challenge its feasibility and the relevance of the clinical endpoints, whether they're clinically meaningful to the patient population as the population would define them. And also really helping to identify investigators and ultimately to create excitement within the patient community. They have played a much larger role.
So
But
I guess,
yeah.
yeah, just to play devil's advocate on that for a second. I mean, I'm not saying they're not
Yeah.
important, but I guess from where I sit, it's almost become table stakes, right? So I feel like for rare disease X, that you're likely to find, you go to the small conference on rare disease X, and everybody with a therapy for rare disease X is at the conference, and they're all meeting with the advocacy groups, and the advocacy groups are certainly helping to publicize. But at the end of the day, the patients are sort of have this huge and expanding palette of options in front of them. In the best cases, obviously there are a lot of underserved areas, but when you talk about the ones that are sort of getting dense from development point of view, and not only are they getting dense in terms of the patient groups, but it feels like they're also getting dense in terms of just the number of who the PIs are, right? That there's really, for many of these diseases, there are only 3, 4, 8, 12 sites in the world, maybe, where you could plausibly host a clinical trial in terms of just the expertise of the investigators. And everyone figures out pretty quickly where those are. Even in areas that are not, quote unquote, maybe as much rare disease, conventional rare disease. We had a situation many years ago working with a company that was working on brain metastases of a pretty common cancer. And even there's really a few sites that just get inundated with the trials. And I've always worried in those situations that every trial is just getting its fair ups. It gets its most 1/nth of the potential patients. So again, I just wonder in those sorts of situations where it seems like there's a high density of development activity relative to the number of patients and the number of PIs, is that just a new fact of life that is just making everything riskier? Or are there specific things that some of the biotech or pharma companies who are working in those areas should or could be doing in light of those facts?
Yes, the points that you've made, I think, are very perceptive, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. Calling them table stakes is not quite the way that I would think about it, but I agree with you that I think it is really just a foot in the door, and everyone is doing it. It's a standard practice today. And every patient advocacy group is open to and willing to partner with any company that will provide funding and support. From where we sit, Frank, what we see is a lot of really inefficient relationships. And it's more in how the relationship serves the purpose of informing patients, attracting them into studies, engaging investigators. We often see the same advocacy group working with multiple sponsors, and each time they sort of have to reinvent the wheel, even though they're following a lot of this very same processes in terms of soliciting input into protocol design, reaching out to patients. So there's a huge opportunity to kind of standardize the ways that sponsors and advocacy groups interact. That's one thing. But the other point that you made about the competition that's out there, that's absolutely true. And it really suggests that so much more needs to be done, including even designing studies where you have multiple companies that are sponsoring a single novel or master protocol, right? Where you can engage the advocacy group and give patients the opportunity to participate or gain access to multiple molecules as part of a larger study. There are other ways we could structure that relationship if we wanted to.
Yeah, so actually that whole umbrella trial question ends up being an interesting one, where you have sort of multiple drugs that are under the same master protocol for the same patient population.
That's right.
And I guess that, I mean, not to oversimplify, but there are sort of two flavors of that we see right now. I mean, there are some where an individual company has a broad enough, a large company almost always
Yeah.
has a broad enough group of agents that are all roughly stage matched that essentially they can run their own umbrella trial, right?
Right.
I would say maybe that's somewhat less common, although maybe easier to execute because it's one company, right? And then on the flip side, you have the ones where multiple there's a master protocol being written and different companies are sort of contributing their own drugs. So do you have a sense that those are a meaningful way to de-risk trials in some of these hard to execute areas?
So I don't have a really good feel for how well they de-risk the trial. In fact, umbrella trials are relatively new, and so we don't have a long sort of historical track record where we can look at whether there has been any type of impact on success rates for the program. We have seen that this particular approach does accelerate the cycle time for a single trial.
Mm-hmm.
But because you have multiple trials that are going on in parallel, you don't have the same sort of begin and end point that you would in a sequential clinical trial. So we don't have good data to really answer that question at this time.
It's interesting. Just because I'm just trying to think about whether as we're talking, again, I'm sort of back, I think I keep circling around kind of the same question, which is, whether it's a rare disease or whether it's in oncology or what have you, what are the modifiable factors from the sponsor point of view versus the ones that sponsors just need to kind of take into account and sort of accept that this is the new reality. So, the modification, on the modifying side, we've talked a little bit about decentralized trials. We talked about sort of things that you might want to do in the protocol. We've talked a little bit about these, more of these umbrella trials, certainly, if the situation kind of allows for it. I mean, do other things come to mind for you where you feel like they're high up on the list of kind of modifiable activities that a sponsor would take?
There are,
yeah.
There are, and or are there approaches that companies are taking to sort of mitigate the risk? And as I mentioned very early on, if you look at a long time horizon, you see that a lot of the things that were deployed or implemented over the last several decades have not had a measurable impact when we look at trials in the aggregate, right? So there was a time when we thought that CRO engagement, right, would actually help drive efficiency. That clearly didn't work or has not really resulted in sustainable improvement. The use of EDC and electronic data capture, that's another place. Right now, some of the hot areas include patient-engaged protocol design. So essentially giving patients an opportunity to comment on a draft protocol before it's actually implemented. And that companies are finding that timelines actual timelines are coming in closer to planned timelines when patients have provided input. So there's some promise there. The whole area of risk-based quality management, Frank, is another place. We're essentially prioritizing areas of risk and really planning for them and recognizing that there are other elements that really are lower priority, and therefore they don't have to be source data verified. We don't have to apply as rigorous sort of a set of resources to monitor them. And that has actually helped to simplify our protocols a bit and the focus in our protocols. But we have yet to see RBQM drive faster timelines. It's primarily contributing to better data quality. You looked like you were going to ask me a question there.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Sorry, I'm thinking about both of those. I'm thinking about there's so much in each of those. Maybe we'll just sit on that last point and then I'll go back to the patient input into the protocol. So if I understand correctly, I think what you were saying was that really the behavior there in terms of mitigating clinical trial risk from a sponsor point of view is sort of deciding that some risks are more important than others, and really using that, at least some of that involves using the protocol as a lever there to basically say, look, we don't need to apply the same level of rigorous data vetting, data capture, et cetera, to every variable, because some of them are just way more important. So let's make sure we sort of focus the guns in the right way. Is that essentially what you were saying?
Exactly. That's right. That's sort of the risk-based approach to allocating resources and attention. And that actually helps to manage a budget more efficiently and manage resources more effectively.
Have you seen any specific companies or specific examples? I mean, it feels to me like that's not like a one-off thing. That's probably something that's sort of an organization and something that would go kind of percolate through an entire organization. Are there any specific companies that you've seen that are doing a good job in that regard? And how would we even know from the outside?
Yeah, very hard to tell from the outside, but there are some companies that are very outspoken about their application of RBQM. I think Pfizer is one of them that comes to mind. Merck is another. AstraZeneca is another. These are all organizations that over the last decade or so have really committed themselves to embracing the principles of RBQM. And it includes, as you were noting, really spending the time up front to anticipate areas where there will be risk exposure, and then prioritizing the areas of risk that most need tight scrutiny, and which are the ones that can be monitored in a more relaxed or less labor-intensive way.
Interesting. Going back to what you were talking about before with patient input into the protocol. I mean, I'm going to confess, I don't keep up as much in that area. And I'm kind of pleasantly surprised to hear us go there, because I can imagine plenty of benefits to that, but I had not necessarily imagined that there was sort of an efficiency benefit. Are you seeing meaningful differences within a given disease area in terms of the extent to which sponsors are or aren't getting patient input? I guess another way of asking that is, are we on sort of the leading part of that curve where there are some sponsors that are really way out ahead in terms of doing that, and there are others that are more lagging?
Yes, I would say yes, that there are some organizations that have now embraced soliciting patient input on every late stage protocol, and some that are now even including them in a phase 2 protocol assessments. So they've sort of included the patient advisory board or the patient input panel in the protocol drafting stage before it's actually finalized.
So, you said before, or one of us said before, that there is this tendency in large companies to take this one size fits all type of approach. So I can imagine there are good things about getting patients involved in all of the protocols, but just to take the devil's advocate position, do you think that's of higher value in some types of trials or some disease areas than others? From purely a sponsor execute, forgetting about the value to the patients, forgetting about sort of value to the overall quality of the drug you get out at the back end, thinking just specifically at sort of about the execution piece. Do you think that this truly is something that it has a meaningful impact across most therapeutic areas and most indications, or do you think that it has a bigger impact in some than others?
I have a hunch that you have a hypothesis here as well. So I'll answer it first.
Okay, you give me yours and I'll give you mine. Okay.
So I think it has the potential to reduce the number of procedures per visit, for example, or it has the promise of removing a procedure that might be a major barrier to getting patients to even choose to enroll in a trial. Whether that's you're going to see that in some diseases over others, I don't believe that per se. But why? What's your theory?
Yeah, I had two thoughts there. One was that in diseases that are a little bit more nascent in terms of drug development, where there just hasn't been a lot of activity, and to the extent there's been clinical development work or clinical trial work, it's mostly been academic. There I could imagine it being extremely valuable just because there's just not a lot of institutional knowledge that anyone has in terms of really where the execution barriers are. So, some of these like I think that, now we're seeing kind of a bifurcation, I think, among quote unquote rare diseases, right? Where some of them are rare, but there's a lot of industry experience in them. And then there are others that are rare and we're all kind of inexperienced. So I guess that was one thought. And then the other thought that I had was that I bet there are a lot of situations in which there are beliefs about which procedures are going to be barriers to patient recruitment that actually might turn out to be wrong. And I guess my reason for thinking that is an experience not on the clinical trial side, but just on the drug development side in general, where I had a client at one point that was developing a sub-Q version of an IV delivered drug. And the entire motivating argument for the team was that, if given the choice, everyone on IV would switch to sub-Q because obviously sub-Q is better, it's more efficient, and they had 10,000 reasons why why essentially 100% of IV patients would switch over. And then they went out and actually talked to patients. And when we did that, we realized that it was actually a lot more complicated, that some patients really didn't want to do the procedure themselves. They liked the idea of going to the doctor. Some patients liked the fact that going once a month or once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks to get an IV was better than once a week or several times a week having a sub-Q. So it was much more nuanced than they.
Fascinating.
So I think there are some of these weird situations where it comes out.
One thing I wanted to mention, which I think for our audience, unless you're really close to clinical trials specifically, may not know this, but even within the same company, when we go from phase 2 to phase 3, same program, often the design of the protocol of the later stage protocol has not been well informed by the final design of the earlier stage trial.
Right.
And it's often due in part to different habits. It's in part due to the lack of institutional knowledge or recall of what was learned in the earlier study. And so we often start with a template of a protocol, perhaps even one that was cut and pasted from an earlier stage of research into the later stage. And often we get patient input just kind of reminds us of things that we probably already learned if we'd been paying attention in the earlier trial.
Okay, that's fair. But on the other hand, when I've seen that, especially in big companies, a major driver has often been the desire to reduce the lag times between trials, right? So if you have a high priority program, often there's a lot of pressure to kind of get the later stage protocol sort of through the mill before you plan for success, basically. There's so many big companies where there's a plan for success philosophy, right? And it does seem like those are a little bit at cross purposes, that you can't wait around and sort of fully digest everything you learned from the early stage trial and also plan for success and avoid wasting 6 to 12 months between phases. And wasting, I'll put in kind of air quotes there, because your argument would be it's not a waste because you learn good things about how to make the trial run more effectively. But I have seen that tension, certainly.
Yeah, we view that whole, what's often referred to as the white space, as you were mentioning, between the phase transitions, we view that as a period of a lot of inefficiency. It just takes so long, especially between end of phase 2 and the beginning of phase 3. During the pandemic, we saw incredible compression of that white space. And so we see more organizations hoping to have these overlapping phase 2 and 3 activity where there's a very, very smooth and almost no white space between phases of research, but that's not common. That is a newer area where we're looking to understand new strategies that are being applied.
Yeah. There's a question here in the chat, which came in early, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't address the elephant in the room of all discussions of clinical trials, which is AI. So again, we could have this sort of overhyped or underhyped discussion about AI in clinical trial success.
Yeah, and great question, because it's obviously so timely. I would say AI is sort of the real buzz-worthy area, end of 2023, that's going to really be quite popular in 2024 as well. We're seeing AI applications in a number of critical areas. In pharmacovigilance, for example, being applied to large data sets, including patient health records and health system records to identify investigators or a very targeted patient population. There are places where we're seeing it being used, but it's mostly aspirational. Now it's being piloted. It is sort of in the hype mode where there's tremendous excitement, but we're seeing very, very measured applications. But the one I mentioned, pharmacovigilance, seems to be one that has been developed quite extensively at this point.
And how about in earlier phase trials? Are there any, again, if you had to advise on one or two areas where maybe a company that wants to invest in this area should put additional chips down? Are there any particular things that come to mind that you've seen in terms of the sort of AI, the overlap between AI and clinical trials?
Oh my goodness, there are just so many applications. I think one place in particular would be actually in the aggregation and integration of disparate data sets. So to queue up the data so that it even could be put through an AI or machine learning process. Okay. That's a place now where we see a lot of concern that we are getting a better understanding of how AI might be used, but we don't have the data sets at a point where they can really be applied well to it. So that would be one place where trying to find ways to unify and integrate data, and there are a number of organizations that are really working on that problem. So many different disparate data sources in clinical research today. And as we look even to gather more data from the clinical care environment to inform clinical research, that's clearly a place where there's a lot of opportunity. I think the other would just be perhaps in the application of AI to inform in real time operating decisions. That's a key place where we know of a few companies that are really moving into that space. Again, so many disparate data sources, but think of all the different systems that are collecting data that might inform the execution of a clinical trial. Data management systems, clinical trial management systems, project management systems, patient recruitment tracking. There's just so many places where if we were able to integrate that data and develop some real-time insights, I think it would address a lot of the operating risk, help us manage operating risk more effectively.
Great. We have about 5 more minutes, and I just want to quick fire through a couple of questions that we've had in the chat. One question had to do with selecting a CRO. And, again, from an outside perspective, we often don't see, how that process happens. And sometimes we don't even know what CRO was selected. But if you're inside a company, especially as a company that maybe is going into the clinic for the first time and hasn't necessarily, is still in the CRO dating period, shall we say, thinking about all of these different factors that we've been discussing having to do with execution risk, protocol risk, and really being smart about both risk and duration management. How should sponsors be thinking about selecting a CRO?
Wow.
It's kind of a big. I mean, and let me refocus it on maybe I'll narrow it down a little bit, right? So, I guess one sub question that I would ask there is, again, back to the question that we talked about before, do you think they're more similar that both what we talked about with large companies, we talked about with small companies, and we could extend that to CROs? Is the approach more similar than different? Meaning if I take my, trial in indication X, whether that's some subset of breast cancer or whether it's some rare genetic disease or whatever, among the big players, am I more like, that have some experience, presumably? So, am I more likely to get similar outcomes from all of them than to see a real spread? That would be one way of thinking about the problem. And I guess a related question would be sort of experience with or trade or track record of using some of these advanced technologies or really being at the forefront of thinking about some of these issues. And by I'm using technologies broadly, that could also include things like getting just the logistics of getting patient input into protocols, et cetera.
Yeah, the reason I hedged a little bit, Frank, is because the way that companies outsource today has just changed dramatically. It's not sort of a one-to-one relationship anymore, although there may be a lead CRO in a lot of projects, but often many of them involve multiple CROs, some providing like a functional area service, others providing a transactional service. So we see many studies where there are multiple CROs involved in a single project or trial.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and this almost goes against comments I made earlier, but often the ultimate deciding factor, because CROs have to have some of the same basic qualifications, including experience in a given disease condition, the infrastructure necessary, even some of the more novel solutions to be able to apply if the sponsor is interested, relationships already established with the sites, a track record conducting trials in that given area. But often what it boils down to is the chemistry, the rapport between the CRO partner and the sponsor. And that's probably the most intangible, the most difficult thing to articulate as an operating insight for an investor. It's really tough to tell. Obviously, companies have long history with preferred providers, and that you can often find relatively easily at conferences, or even occasionally in meetings. You can see at conferences, for example, a CRO is co-presenting with a sponsor representative on an experience in a trial, so it's not hard to know who's working with whom necessarily, unless you're looking at the smaller companies. But it defies sort of simple logic. By selecting a given CRO, there's no guarantee that you're going to get more efficient and better performance.
Good. And then last question, and we're just going to, this is really the 30-second quick fire, which is someone stops you and says, what are the things, they're an external investor, they're looking from the outside, and they're looking at a trial. What are the things that should keep them up at night in terms of, things that they can discern about any of the things we've talked about, the protocol, execution capabilities, any of these types of things? What things should make them nervous?
So I would say, and we have published a number of papers on this, there are certain factors that are predictive of longer timelines, more inefficiency, as well as even higher failure rates. So I would encourage a review of some of those papers, looking at the number of sites and the number of countries where the trial is being conducted. If it's a relatively large number, that's usually a red flag that this is going to take longer and there's elevated risk. If you can tell whether a specific additional technologies or design elements are being incorporated relative to other protocols within a disease condition, that's usually an indicator that this is a more complex design. And I would say, because I know you write about a lot of this extensively, I would say one of the areas that I don't see written about a lot, but that might be a really good bellwether, is if you can get your hands on a protocol, to really try to review it as if you were your mother considering participation in the trial. There is a lot about design that is just very common sense. And you can tell very quickly, this just looks like a trial that's going to be too difficult to attract and enroll patients and to keep them in our studies as well.
Awesome. That's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Ken, for taking the time for doing this. Super. It was just a pleasure for me. If the people listening got half as much value out of it as I did, then they probably had a good time. I'll just say, for those of you who are listening, this is part of a 3-part series we're going to be doing on decoding clinical trials. The next one is coming up on October 2nd, and my guest, very happy that I'm going to be hosting Professor Sermene Pangalos from AstraZeneca. We're going to talk about the 5 Rs, which is AZ's system for evaluating early stage trials. We're going to talk about how big pharma assess data, make decisions, and think about deals when it comes to clinical development. It's going to be great. So stay tuned for that. That'll be on the STAT website. So again, stay safe, be well, everybody. And thank you so much for joining. And again, thank you